Hi, welcome to Lecture 4 for Dr. Maggie Shiffrar's Introduction to Psychology class at Cal State Northridge. In this series of lectures, we're going to talk about neuroscience, and we're going to focus a lot on neurons and brains in this lecture. We're going to start out talking about the building blocks of the human brain, which are neurons but also glial cells. We're going to talk about the structure of your brain, and we're going to review the entire nervous system. This is a ridiculously large amount to do in a small amount of time. Most researchers in neuroscience dedicate their lives to studying maybe one sentence of what we're going to say here today. But I want to give you just a taste of all of the different and interesting aspects there are to neuroscience. So, first of all, neurons. What are neurons? Neurons are the building blocks of your brain. They are the cells that do computations and communicate information with each other. So your brain is made up of a highly interconnected network of neurons. You have, between your two ears, about 86 billion neurons. That's billion with a B. They're massively interconnected. The brain is one of the most complicated, if not the most complicated thing that we know of. Interestingly, different animals have different kinds of brains, but the basic structure of the neuron is preserved across all of those different kinds of brains. It's as if, to use this brick analogy, you can use the same brick to build lots of different kinds of houses. You can use the same kinds of neurons to build lots of different kinds of brains. So there are two actual building blocks to the human brain. One is a neuron. We're going to focus on that first. Those are the cells that communicate information. And the second one is the glial cells. Glia you can think of as helping cells, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But we'll talk about those in a minute. Okay. The neuron was discovered by Santiago Ramon y Cajal, and he got the Nobel Prize for his work on on neurons. And you can see in the middle of this slide a drawing of some of his neurons, some of the neurons that he studied. The beauty of his work is that he discovered for the first time that neurons are individual cells. And actually, neurons don't touch other neurons to communicate. There's actually a gap that we'll talk about between neurons. I was on a trip once, and one of the guys on the trip had Ramon y Cajal's neurons tattooed on the back of his legs. So I add that just for your amusement. The basic parts of a neuron, they've got an input center, they've got a processing center, and they've got output. So the input is the dendrites. These are like little tree branches that receive information from other neurons. Basically, you can imagine them as ears listening to what other neurons are saying. If other neurons are talking a lot, if there's a lot of activity, then they're going to send a signal to the dendrites, and the dendrites are going to take that information and integrate it and process it in the cell body of the neuron. Okay, so the cell body comes next. If the cell body says, based on what other neurons are telling me, there's something going on out there, then that neuron's going to decide, okay, I need to pass on the message that there's something going on out there that's relevant to me. So if there's enough information integrated in the cell body, what happens is the cell body fires a signal. It's an electrical potential that we call the action potential, and it sends it down the axon. So it's going to send it down the axon, and here's a slide of the axon. The axon is this narrow, long sort of branch. The signal goes down that branch until the very end. And when you get to the end of an axon, you run into the end of the axon called axon terminals. And that's the direction of the impulse. So it goes from the cell body down the axon to the end of the axon, to the axon terminals. That electrical potential, it's very important that within a neuron, information is transmitted electrically. And that electrical potential comes from ions, positively and negatively charged ions, going in and out of the membrane of the axon. So it's not that chemicals are going down the axon that's carrying a signal. Within a neuron, signal transmission is electrical, and it comes from the changes of these little local changes of these axons going in and out of the membrane. And that change in activity, that's what goes down the axon. It's a bit like if you go to a sporting event and see people stand up or just raise their hands and do the wave. It's the local motion of people's hands. It's that change that moves around the stadium. The wave is not people running around the stadium. It's the energy. It's the change in the signal. Okay. To transmit information quickly along the length of an axon, Mother Nature developed a kind of insulation called myelin that speeds transmission of information, electrical information, along the length of the axon. And you can think of myelin as a kind of insulation, like rolls of insulation that you sometimes see in a truck or up in your attic. And when you've got those rolls of insulation, the myelin, what the signal can do is jump between gaps in the insulation. So it speeds up signal transmission quite a bit. You may have heard of a disease called MS, or multiple sclerosis. Sclerosis means scarring, and MS is understood as a kind of autoimmune disease where your immune system attacks your myelin and sort of chews it up and eats it up. That's what MS is. It's a destruction, increasing destruction of the myelin that's wrapped around your axons. It often begins when people are in their 20s, 30s, sometimes 40s, but a lot of times it's folks in their 20s, so I like to talk about it in college. MS is funny. You might say, well, how do I know? What are the symptoms? How do I know if I have MS? Well, it turns out that the symptoms vary dramatically, but they all depend on the same thing. Where in your brain is the myelin being chewed up? So if the myelin that's being destroyed is wrapped around axons that help your visual cortex, which we'll talk about, visual cortex interpret information from your eyes, then your symptom for MS might be blurry vision. On the other hand, if the axon that's getting destroyed is wrapped around axons that have something to do with the way your legs and feet move, then it might be weaknesses in your legs and feet. Okay, so that's what I'm going to tell you as an introduction to neurons. Now I want to switch gears quickly to glial cells. There's actually more glia in your brain than there are neurons. And glia is a Greek word meaning glue. And you can think of glial cells, actually they do an amazing number of things, but you can think of glial cells as a sort of scaffolding. So when a building's being constructed, they put that big scaffolding on the outside of the building if it's a multi-story building. Glia, one of the things that glia does is tell neurons where they should grow. So it provides supporting structure. Glia are actually the cells that produce the myelin that gets wrapped around your axons. But glial cells are not neurons because glia do not communicate with each other. What they do is they're helping cells. They do not, as far as we know, transmit information themselves. And in the bottom middle part of the slide I have up, you can see someone's trying to grow neurons in a solution that either has glial cells in it or does not have glial cells in it. And what you can see is the side of the solution that has glia in it. There's a lot more neurons and they're a lot more interconnected with each other. The side of the picture that does not have glial cells in it, You could tell there's very few neurons, and they're not interconnected in a complex way. The only time that you probably heard about glial cells is when it comes to a very deadly kind of cancer called glioblastoma. Glioblastoma. You may remember a couple of years ago that a very famous senator from the state of Arizona, John McCain, died of a kind of brain cancer. He had glioblastoma. And the reason glioblastoma is so deadly is it's a cancer of the glial cells. The glial cells, remember I said they're the scaffolding, they're super connected with one another. They're also super connected with blood vessels. So when your neurons are active, they need food, and the food that they need is oxygen and glucose. And it's the glial cells that connect the oxygen and glucose that comes from blood vessels. It connects them to the neurons. So when the cancer gets into the glial cells, and the glial cells are very connected with blood vessels, it's easy for the cancer to spread, which is why even though there have been significant advances in the treatment of many different cancers, with glioblastoma, the life expectancy after diagnosis is about 14 months. Okay, we're going to come back here in just a minute, and I'm going to start talking about not the individual building blocks of the brain, but the brain itself. So hang on.